Through things. It's actually relatively simple stuff that we're going to talk about. But my job really, I'm one of the editors at Worldwide Challenge, but my job really is writing coach for the team of people who put together the content that goes on Worldwide Challenge magazine, as well as crew.org, as well as the staff web, a couple of radio broadcasts, and some video production. So I think about how to help people put words together all day long. And prayer letters are one of those things you guys didn't sign up for. I mean, you joined staff because you were excited about God and the Great Commission, and someone along the way said you have to write people about this, and maybe English class was the class you hated the most, or maybe when you stare at that page you get a stomach ache. Today I'm actually just going to be talking about the secret to write a better prayer letter. Because I think, here's what you know about writing a prayer letter in general. Something is better than nothing. On those months when you think, I don't know what to say, and maybe after this seminar I don't have the energy or the time to do what Erik said, don't let that be a reason not to write something. And at the very, very base, I'll give you a couple of my own opinions of what should go on every prayer letter. And it's actually written at the top of the sheet that's at your desk. If you need one, there's one in the back. And everyone actually needs one of these because you'll be using the paper for something else. But at the very base, you should have a picture of yourself. In my opinion, it should be 1 page long, because the longer it is, the less likelihood that your donor is going to actually read it. You should put a date on it, and a specific one, not just fall 2012, but today, October 12th, 2012. And then you want to include your first and last name in case they support more than one person. That's very possible. You want to include your ministry name, even though you know that all they think about is what you do with campus ministry or Jesus Film. It just would be helpful to remind them. And then some contact information, whether that's your Facebook page or whether that's your email or cell phone or however you want them to be able to reach you. Because there's going to come a time when they want to send you an extra check or they want to ask you a question. And so you want them to be able to just pull out that latest prayer letter and say, okay, this is how I do it. The picture just helps them connect with you and brings them back to that moment when they met you. Or if they've never met you, if you've just added them to your list because of a referral or whatever, it makes them feel like they know you better. There's a lot of responsibility on the shoulders of the prayer letter. But at the beginning I said this was the secret to writing a better prayer letter, and that secret really is story, which is probably a little frustrating because story writing is hard, and yet story writing is powerful because stories allow the person to experience with you what's happened, and that therefore makes them feel like they're a part of what your ministry is. They feel an emotional connection to it. But here's where we're going to stop feeling bad for ourselves about how hard it is, and you're actually going to take a little 6-minute break from lunch. You're going to flip that piece of paper over, and you are going to write a story. And you've got 6 minutes to do it. Here are a couple of rules that you need to know. The first rule is everyone has to do this. If you came into the room, you're stuck. You have to write this story. The second rule is that it has to have happened to, see, he's running away. Ryan's like, I didn't send her to write nothing. I'm out of this room. Has to be something that happened to you. So it has to be true. Has to have happened in the last week. And you have 6 minutes to do it. So let me give you an example. It could be that last night, Emily and I were talking and she watched a DVD series last night. So maybe the story is about her putting on the DVD. Maybe it's that she went and got groceries. We're not talking about the next cover story for Worldwide Challenge. Just something that happened that you were a part of, that you did. Any questions? Anybody need a pen? We need 3, 4 pens. How was that? What's good for you? Anybody think that was awful?
Come up with an idea.
Yeah? Say that again?
It's hard to come up with an idea.
Okay.
The hardest part for me is finding the idea.
But you wrote something, looks like. Might not have been the best idea in the world, but you started, right? I think that's one of the lessons that if you can walk away from this, and to this afternoon, my office is giving us time to work on prayer letters. And I have thought, I don't know what to write. And I think part of the antidote to that is just sitting down and doing it. Especially if you're not committed to using the first thing that comes out of your head. But if you just start, you might end up in a good place, but there's more to tell than you realize. Well, what we're actually going to do is I'm going to go through 7 elements that I think are helpful in a story. And then at the end of our time together, I'm going to give you time to go back and look at what you just wrote and analyze it and see, were those 7 elements in there? And is there a way to make it better? But for now, flip your paper over. And little disclaimer, my opinion is what this seminar is based on. I just spent 2 days in New York City last week. And it was a storytelling seminar that they brought in this masterful consultant to Pixar. She was telling us all about all the important parts of a good story. She didn't mention, using these exact words, the things that I mentioned. So it's not like this was handed down from Mount Sinai or anything. But I think if you look at stories and all of the things that she told us, these elements were a part of that. You'll be able to identify that, yes, these parts are in stories, and stories are everywhere. Some are good, some are not so good. I have a terrible memory. And so in order for me to remember things, especially something more than one thing, like 7 things, I try and come up with little formulas, pictures, some kind of aid, memory aid. So for me, the 7 elements of a story, I picture an elephant. Elephant. It works for me. So that's what you've got there is my hand drawings of an elephant. And you're going to find that some of these elements are actually very, very basic, and that's okay. Even as basic as they are, we sometimes forget them, even those of us who are sitting around doing writing all day long. But let's start with the first one, which is the head of the elephant. That is the beginning of the story. Here is what we are tempted to do, especially in a prayer letter. We are tempted to say something like, I am sitting down right now to write you a letter about all the things that have happened in this last month. And there were so many things that happened in this last month that I had to choose from to tell you about. So I thought about this idea and decided that wasn't that interesting, but I thought I could tell you this one and that would take too long, so I'm just going to tell you this one. It is much better for you to just dive right into the story right away. Just drop them into a scene where they feel like they're right there next to you and experiencing it with you at the same time. That might feel a little awkward, but after a while you'll get used to it. And your readers will thank you because they'll immediately be connected. You'll find, if you pay attention to your own reading style, you'll find you skim those paragraphs that say, how you doing, blah, 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 blah. And that's kind of what your brain does. It just says, where does this get interesting? And it goes to that. So if you just start there, they will too. Second element is focus. Now this is actually the elephant of the body. This is really important and, in my opinion, one of the hardest things to do. How many of you are coffee drinkers? Okay, so for those of you who aren't coffee drinkers, you can appreciate how much we coffee drinkers like that black gold that comes out of the coffee pot. But it starts with putting all those filters into all those grinds into a filter, right? And you don't want those grinds to come through on the other end. You want those to stay in there and a little thin stream to come out at the bottom and give you the good stuff. So when you pick a focus, it helps you know what you're going to keep and actually tell and what you're going to drop or not tell. Each of your stories, there were a lot of facts or pieces of information that you could have told in that story. If, for instance, you wrote a story about how you use solarium, Wednesday night at your care group, which is what I just did Wednesday night, so I'm pulling it from that one. I could tell you about how I walked to the care group meeting, or I could tell you about how the 2-year-old son of the people whose house we were at came running up to me. But if my focus is sharing the Solarium, then I'm not going to tell you any of that stuff. I'm going to talk about spreading the cards out on the table. I'm going to leave out worship, which was the first 25 minutes. I'm going to leave out announcements, which was 5 minutes before that. I might even leave out why we're doing Solarium. I'm just going to drop you into the fact that even though we're doing this for an outreach in December and I was practicing with my care group, I'm just going to get right into spreading the cards out onto the front. And I'm only going to tell that part of the evening because that's my focus. Focus also tells you where to put the camera. I've got a 12-year-old son 13-year-old son who is taking a writing class right now. And it was really helpful for me as I was explaining to him, where are you going to put the camera? Whose shoulder are you going to put the camera on? He understood that language, and I think it translates to everything we're doing. So when you think about the movie Titanic, they were telling the story, the movie was telling the story about the ship that sunk and whatever. We all know that story. In fact, I remember when it came out, everyone joked about how they knew how the movie was going to end before they even saw it. Yeah, the ship sinks. But they put the camera right on Rose's shoulder. And so we experienced the guy who made the ship. We experienced the captain of the ship. We experienced everything through her eyes. She is the focus of the Titanic story. And you need to commit, when you tell a story, to one particular person that you're telling it through. If you're talking about, if I'm going to talk about using Solarium with my care group, I don't want to just say, everybody looked at the Solarium cards. I might look at it from one of their perspectives. Maybe it's Paul, who was surprised at how easy these pictures were to communicate deep things. Or maybe it's Val, who cried while she was communicating these things. Or maybe it was me, who was excited to train them. But I'm not going to tell you from all their perspectives. I'm going to pick one. That's not going to eliminate those perspectives, just like Rose allowed us to see the captain. It allowed us to see the guy who invented the ship. But I know where I'm committing so that the reader doesn't get disoriented. And when you've only got a page long, it's really important for you to think about which angle is this story going to be from. And by the way, when you're telling stories about people becoming Christians, your part is always less interesting than their part, because the reader thinks a missionary is doing their job when they lead people to Christ. So they kind of dismiss that as, you know, punching the clock and going and doing it. If you tell me the backstory behind Mary and who she was and what she was dealing with, what she was thinking about, and why she was open to the gospel, that's a much, much more interesting story. But that goes back to focus. Focus is really hard. Any questions about it at all? In terms of the element? It's pretty simple. All these ideas are very easy. They're just hard to apply. All right, well, if you come up with questions, you can ask me at the end. I'll stay after one. Ambition is the third element, and I attached that to the trunk. That essentially is the part of the elephant that seems to go forward. It's the one that picks up the peanuts and, you know, swings around and maybe hits the trees or whatever. It's sort of pushing the elephant forward, and the ambition is what pushes your story forward. In the case of the care group Solarium cards, does everyone know what Solarium is before I keep using this reference? Raise your hand if you don't know what Solarium is, because I don't want to. Okay. So in the case of the Solarium cards with my care group, the ambition was that we want to do an outreach in December. And they had come up with this idea, and I thought Solarium actually will work really, really well. So my ambition in the story of telling you this was I wanted them to not only experience what it was like to answer the questions, but also experience what it was like to ask the questions. So I wanted to equip them for this outreach down the way. Ambition basically answers the question why. If you don't know why you're telling this story, you probably shouldn't tell it. So, again, fairly simplistic, but something that we often overlook. We just think, oh, I should tell the story because it happened. Well, that works for this exercise that I had you do. I just told you to write a story. But you might be thinking to yourself, why would anyone want to listen to this? There's no point in me watching a DVD last night or me going to the grocery store. So you have to think through what's the reason I'm telling it. Fourth element is complication. Those are the pointy parts on the elephant, the tusks. Every good story needs complication. Barney does not have complication in it. Neither do the Teletubbies and other children's stories, because children are afraid at ages 2 years old. So you don't want to give them anything that's going to upset them. But once you outgrow that, pretty darn quick, if you don't have something that makes the reader, listener, viewer want to find out what happens, there's no reason for them to stay committed. Even if they are sending you $50 a month. At the beginning of that letter, you have to give them a reason to get to the end of the letter. How many of you guys have seen The Princess Bride before? Okay, so by way of explanation, this is a strange little movie. And I think all I need to tell you for you to understand this clip is that all the men on the boat are bad, and the woman on the boat is a princess who's trying to get away from them. They've kidnapped her. And the overarching story is that a little boy is homesick and his grandfather comes and reads a book to him. And when his grandfather starts to read the book about the princess and the kidnappers and all this other stuff, the boy is afraid that this is just going to be a boring book. He thinks, it sounds dumb, it sounds like a kissing book. He's really not interested because princess and bride. And so I think that's all you need to know in order to understand what we're about to show you.
All right. Let's see. She was in the water. The eel was coming after her. She was frightened. The eel started to charge her, and then...
Put her down! Put her down!
So, even this kid who really didn't want to watch this movie, or listen to this book actually, suddenly is very, very interested because there's a complication. He wants to know what's going to happen. You're not going to have probably very many shrieking eels in your ministry that you're running into. There might be one or two that you actually bump into over the many years that you stay on staff, but what your challenge is to find the complication in the story. It's the middle, that one. Yeah, thank you. Find the complication in your everyday experience. A great example I have of this is a coworker years ago, one of the photographers for Worldwide Challenge, wrote a prayer letter about how somebody was walking down the streets of New York backwards. And as they were walking down the streets of New York backwards, they were facing this other person who was walking towards them. And everybody wanted to know, who was this person who was walking? Was he famous? And why was this other person walking backwards? Now, all he was doing was saying, I was doing my job. I was walking backwards, taking pictures of Jack, who was walking forwards. But he thought about the fact that other people watching this scene would find that strange. To Pat, it was everyday life. There was nothing more normal than walking backwards, taking a picture of a guy walking forward. And yet he created this complication that made the reader want to know what was going on. Who was this person? Why was someone walking backwards? And then he filled in all the cracks until he got to the end. And the reader was like, oh, I'm glad I support him. What a cool thing he does and what cool experiences he has. So you have to sometimes look for the complication that's right there in front of you. Do not make one up. Don't make it more, oh no, what's going to happen if that person trips walking backwards or whatever. I mean, Pat didn't over-dramatize the situation. He just captured what was there and used it as a complication all by itself. Sometimes your temptation is going to be make things more dangerous or more scary than they are, and that's an error. Any questions about the complication at all? The next element of a story, every story needs to have action. And that's the feet of the elephant. That's what actually moves the elephant in one direction or another. If you don't have anybody going anywhere or doing anything, you're probably not telling a story. You're probably just listing facts or information. So one of the ways you can improve your storytelling kind of goes back to Mrs. Bubenek in 5th grade, the English teacher who made you circle your verbs. For those of you who haven't heard that word in a long time, that's the word that does something in the sentence. Go back and actually circle those words and say, okay, can I actually is? No, I can't. So maybe I can think of a different word that does that. Maybe instead of saying I went to the store, you can say I biked to the store. Well, that's already far more interesting than just wenting. Minister is a verb we all like to use, but I'd like any of you to come up and minister for me right now. It's one of those things that we all attach a certain meaning to, but it doesn't really mean anything, or it means many things to people, and it's not super clear. If you're ministering by putting bandages on, then say that. If you're ministering by talking about the gospel, then say that. But go ahead and use words that you mean so that people can visualize what it is that's actually happening. The next element is details. That's the ears on the elephant. If we didn't have those ears on the elephant, we might confuse it for a fat rabbit. No, it is an elephant. Those ears are what help us to go, okay, I know what that is. And when you start saying Mary is Val is a 43-year-old single woman in my care group who is the church secretary, and yet she was the one who was crying when we were going through the solarium. It makes you really connect with her, and you start to think about who she is, and you start to believe that this really happened than if I just told you one of the people started crying. So those couple of details, and you have to decide. You don't want to put too many details in there. Notice there's only 2 ears on that elephant and not a whole bunch of other things. There's not wrinkles drawn all over the body, and because after a while it starts to get complicated and confusing and you don't know what you're supposed to pay attention to. But you just give enough details that help the reader go, oh, I can really see this happening. If I told you my daughter was messy, you'd go, okay, I think I know what that means. But if I told you that this morning at breakfast she got ketchup behind her ear, you'd really understand what I'm talking about. And if I told you that she dropped food, on the floor and the dog always sits next to her chair when she eats, now you really understand what I mean by messy. So don't be afraid to use those, but be careful that you don't use too many of them. Details really make the story believable. You ever get one of those things by email and it tells you this amazing story of something that happens and you just think, that didn't really happen. There's no way that's true. What's happened in the last 10 years is that those are now coming with all kinds of details. And the reason they're doing that is to make them more believable. They might even tell you where they came from. Sometimes they even have a phone number or an email on there to make you say, oh, well, since I can track it back, it must be real. Well, that's the reason they're putting those details on there, is to make it more believable. Details just do that. But they also make it more relatable to the donor that you're trying to connect to. You want them to feel like, hey, maybe I could learn how to share my faith, or maybe I could do those things that he's doing for God. And then the purposeful idea is the idea of only using the details that actually serve the purpose of your story. Think through what it is that your ambition is, what's getting in the way of that ambition with the complication. Make sure your details aren't just sending me down another trail that makes it hard for me to figure out. Why is he telling me the color of her eyes? Why is he telling me how tall she is? I don't need to know that stuff. I just want to understand why she was crying. Any questions about that? All right. Last element is the end. You need to really think through where you're going to stop that story. Going back to the solarium one, do I stop right when Val starts to tell us about why this picture of a cityscape is meaningful to her and why it represents her spiritual journey? Do I tell you what she said about the building and how it represented her spiritual journey? Or do I stop when someone pats her on the back and says, thank you so much for telling us stuff we've never heard that before about you? I probably don't stop with, and then we planned what we were going to do, and then we all sat around and had cookies, and we had coffee, and I found out that so-and-so is going to have a baby next month, or whatever. You want to remember what your story is, what your focus is, and pick out where you're going to end. In your prayer letter, you want to bring meaning to the reader. But the end is where that complication has been flying around. It's been there, and the end is where you get rid of the complication. If you get rid of the complication too soon, then you've told them you can stop here. There's no reason to keep going. You want to kind of drag that complication towards the end of the thing, and that's when you resolve it. But it resolves the complication, and it rewards the reader. It basically says, this is the reason why you just invested 4 or 5 minutes, or however long, in hearing the story, or reading the story, or watching the story. This is what it means to you. Okay, let's review the elements. Look up from your paper so there's no cheating, and then I will show you the different body parts, and you tell me what they are. So the first one is what? The beginning, that's right. What's the second one? Focus, which is the body. What's the next? Ambition, yep, it's the thing that sort of drives the story forward. Complication, those are the tusks that are sticking out, the pointy part of the elephant. That's the part that is difficult. Action, it's moving the story forward, yep. Details, that's the part that helps us know what the heck this is. And what's the last part? The end. Yep. Very good. Okay. So you might be tempted to go, oh, once I do this, it's going to solve everything. And it's not really a formula. You definitely don't need to do this on every prayer letter or nothing, like I said at the beginning. And all these parts really are in there. Think about Jack and Jill. Jack and Jill went up a hill to fetch a pail of water. So we know who the focus is on. It's on Jack and Jill. We know we've been thrown right into the story. We've got enough details to sort of imagine the picture. There's a scene of a hill, and there's a bucket, and there's 2 kids, we assume, actually. The ambition, of course, is to get the pail of water. What's the complication? Jack fell down and broke his crown. And Jill came tumbling after, and the end just stops with them going back down at the bottom of the hill, and that's the end. And with no water. Yes, that's true. Sad Jack and Jill. But that's, so even though it's not necessarily a formula, those parts are going to be in almost every story that you can think of. There is an important step. That's the one down there at the bottom with a little asterisk. And that is what I like to think of as the rewrite edit stage. That's when you go back in and you put a little bit more in there, like eyelashes, eyebrows, to help you go, oh, it's a friendly elephant. That's where you read over, or you have someone else read over what you wrote, and you don't think that just because you wrote it, it's done. That is, if I could get you guys to walk away with one thing, even if you never write a story on a prayer letter ever, if you would just promise to not publish it as soon as you hit the last period and sign that sucker, if you could just at least read it out loud once, or get your roommate or your spouse or your coworker to read it out loud once, that's going to help you catch things that you wouldn't see when you just look at it and when you type it. The writers team, they'll rewrite a story 7 or 8 times before we send it off to be published. It's a very normal process. Neil Simon said that in baseball, you only get 3 swings and you're out. In rewriting, you get almost as many swings as you want, and you know sooner or later you'll hit the ball. So go ahead and take the time to think through how to make that story better and stronger in the purpose of what you're trying to communicate to your donors. Okay. I'm going to give you 6.5 minutes. But actually, before that, let me take some time for question and answer. Let me tell you what I would normally do. I would normally say, okay, you're going to spend 2 minutes to go back on your draft. And for those of you who don't have to leave right at 1 o'clock, it would be a good idea for you to actually just try this. But you take 2 minutes, you go back and you look at the 7 elements, you figure out, did I have a beginning? Did I start in the right place? Did I have a complication, or was there nothing complicated about this situation? Was my action interesting enough, or did it sit still? Did I wrap things up, or did I just stop instead of ending? And then take 4.5 minutes to actually write. I do this because in 10 minutes, you'll have something that you probably would be surprised you're capable of doing. So that's the reason why the time clock locks are on there, to help you understand this process, although it's draining and hard, especially to come up with something good, isn't as draining and hard as you think it is. So before I do that, does anyone have any questions that they haven't asked? Because you guys are the quietest group I've ever done this for. And I've probably done this 15 times.
You're saying 1 page. Do you have an estimated word count?
It depends on how big your picture is. So, you know, sometimes I put more than 1 picture in there. I think white space is always good. I actually have a Mac, so I use a program called Pages, and it creates all sorts of wonderful, easy templates for me to just slam my stuff into. I don't have to work hard to make it look attractive. Some of the templates allow me 300 words, some of them allow me 500. It depends. And again, that's my opinion. But I get a prayer letter from a friend it's 4 pages long, and I have to gear myself up to read it. And she's a good writer, but I just think, oh. I complain as soon as it comes, and I think this is going to take a long time to get through. It's only 4 pages. Yeah.
What is a good indicator or filter to determine if you're using too many details? Or is there one in particular that you use to kind of, when you're in the editing stage, you say, okay, these are details?
It's a great question. Probably my biggest weakness as a writer is using too many details. Because I think, I noticed that she did this with her fingers, so I'm going to tell people that I noticed that. So I think probably a good indicator is to ask yourself, does this accelerate the story, or does it get in the way? And when you're trying to squeeze it onto 1 page, the details are usually, it's the focus and the details that are going to get you over 1 page. So you start to ask, is it really necessary for me to say that, you know, Val's the church secretary, or that she's 42, or that she's single? Maybe none of that has anything to do with what's going on. Maybe the more important detail is that she never speaks in care group, but that night, not only was she speaking, she was crying about her own story. And maybe just saying she never speaks is 3 words as opposed to she's single and she's blah, 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 blah. So it's asking, maybe it's just underlining them and saying, does this one belong? Does this one belong? Does this one belong? Anyone else?
Yeah, excuse me. A lot of the projects I'm working on, I'm not allowed to write about.
Mm-hmm.
So sharing changed life stories from the Jesus film is basically about all I could do,
Mm-hmm.
and they're pre-written. So
How do you work with those?
How can I relate? I mean, I'm sure there's certain things I can write.
Yep.
But I can't go in and say, oh, we've got this new,
Mm-hmm.
I can, like, I call it the blanket.
Mm-hmm.
Throw the blanket out there, and I've done that several times where I just kind of throw a blanket out. We're working on a new project. I can't give you the details. Please pray for, or please join us in.
Sure, but you might be able to explain the process to them, the part that you're working on. You might be able to say something like, well, you were saying that it was this 4 Laws app that you had.
I wasn't even supposed to tell you that.
Okay, whoops. But maybe you could
Gonna
say
swear
something
you to
like,
secrecy.
yeah, sorry. But maybe you could say something like, we're working on an evangelistic tool.
Yeah. Okay,
And
just the wording of
yeah,
that's what I mean by blanket.
but you
The
want to
wording of it.
as much specific as you can that relates to you. You're part of it. You know, it's okay to tell other people's stories, by the way. If you need a good story, because all of us are working at headquarters, at least this year, if you need good stories, go ahead and tell something from crew.org or from coworkers or other parts of your ministry.
Jesus Film's got a bunch too.
Jesus Film stories, if you're in Jesus Film or campus or whatever. There's nothing wrong with doing that, as long as you can figure out a way that connects your reader back to you. In the end, that you help them see, this is why I'm so committed to what I do, because change lives like Mary's, you know, or whatever. And so it's not real necessary for you to be the center focal point of every story in order for it to be effective. Emily was raising support. She wrote a great story about somebody else on our team who went to Japan. And it was all about the Japan tsunami. Emily wasn't in Japan at all, but she connected it back to herself and was able to show, this is what I do.
Our team, yeah,
Mhm.
this is-
That's what I believe in.
The other can do something like that.
I've heard you again. You can do anything you want. I'm not the official rules of what you must. You can do 4 pages. You can do 20 pages. I think what I've read in this book, actually, Writing Exceptional Missionary Newsletters, is that they suggest you do family once a year, where you just send them maybe your June letters, all just pictures of your kids, and just say, here's what's going on with the kids. Or maybe you include a small picture on every newsletter that just says, here's Freddie's first basketball game, or whatever. Another option is to actually do a prayer card where it's separate from the letter, and it's like in the shape of a bookmark, and they can take that out, and for the month of October they can pray for these things, and that's where you might mention some update from them. We've got a donor who we support this staff couple. They tell a story on every single letter, and in a box they have family update every single time, and they tell us about what their 2 kids are doing. And I always read them, and their kids are out of the home. They're adults now, and they still write about Zach and Sarah. So, and I read it. So that might be one way where you just commit to, I'm just going to give them this little thing because we've heard that people want that. A lot of different ways. But I would still say 1 page.
Would that be like an insert or something extra
Yep.
to throw in? Okay.
Yep, you could do that. Any other questions? Please send your prayer letters to stories@crew.org. Just add that email address. If you've got a digital process of how you send your prayer letters out, send them to us. Because the writers basically take that as story ideas and starters. Yesterday we had a meeting together where we were trying to figure out who would be a good person to talk to who disciples adults. And if they're getting their letters from you and they read, oh, Mel does a great job of discipling adults. It might not be his ministry, or it might not be what you do necessarily. It's just going to help us to do a better job of our job of showing what God's doing around the world. But it also might be the story that's going on in your ministry that maybe we need to tell. So if you are willing to, we would love to get them. And we don't sit around and critique them either, lest that be your biggest fear. We don't go, look at this. So we get what we need out of them, and then we file them in the trash. All right, guys. Well, thank you very much for your time. I promised I'd stop at 1, so I don't have copies of examples to show you and all that other stuff. But take the time to do this part, this checking your story, applying it, because what that does is it gives you practice of working with these 7 elements. Even if the story you wrote is stupid, it'll still give you practice to say, I actually could do that. And we are talking about 6.5 minutes. So if you've got to go now, then find 6.5 minutes today where you actually spend the time to do it.